everyone, welcome back to the Tox Lab. I'm Rebecca.
I'm Rob. So this week on the Tox Lab, we're going to be looking at the rising trend of street benzodiazepines. In particular, the rise in novel benzodiazepines that have never been approved for therapeutic use. Before we jump into this week's study, I wanted to talk a bit about benzodiazepines because we've mentioned them a few times on this podcast. But just wanted to go over what they were. So what are they? Well, benzodiazepines, or benzos, are a group of drugs that act on the central nervous system, and they make you feel calm, relaxed, sleepy. Medically, they're used a lot for conditions like anxiety, insomnia, and sometimes even muscle spasms. So how do benzodiazepines work? If you imagine your brain is a big complex web of neurons, and they're all sending messages left, right, and centre, one of the neurotransmitters that helps transmit signals is this compound called GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid. And its job basically is to slow down signal transmission within that web of neurons. So it's kind of like the brakes of the brain. What benzos do is they boost the brakes. They make GABA do its job more efficiently. And as a result, you can kind of calm down neurotransmission. So they bind to the GABA receptor. They don't directly activate it, but they bind to a different part of the receptor. And that makes it more sensitive. So effectively, you're turning the volume up on the brakes. And this makes the brain slow down. As a result, you've got this enhanced GABA effect, and benzos help quieten the mind. They reduce anxiety, they cause muscle relaxation, they make you drowsy. And so it's really, really effective for sort of short-term issues like panic attacks, stress. But there is a downside, and over time you can become dependent on this effect. And as a result, if you've then not got the benzodiazepine present, you get a rebound anxiety. Over time, you might come to rely on benzos to feel calm, and then you need to sort of use higher and higher doses in order to get the same effect. And this we've talked about before is this effect called tolerance. But even worse, actually, if you suddenly stop taking the drug, you can then have withdrawal. Your brain can struggle to cope without the benzos being present. And so you can get withdrawal symptoms, anxiety, insomnia, and extreme cases can cause seizures. And actually, benzo withdrawal has been fatal before, so it is very significant. So, Rebecca, why don't you introduce us to this week's study?
So the paper we're planning on talking about this week is titled Impact of Street Benzodiazepines on Drug-Related Deaths in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So in this paper, they looked at drug-related deaths in England, Wales and Northern Ireland where benzodiazepines have been detected. And to do this, they used NP-SUM data. So NP-SUM stands for the National Programme on Substance Use Mortality. They collate reports from coroners since 1997 on drug-related deaths in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. Currently, they cover 78 out of 93 coronial jurisdictions, and a drug-related death is basically any death where drugs are thought to be contributory to that death. So with this data set, they looked at the type of benzos that had been detected and whether they were prescription benzos or street benzos. So they've determined street benzos to be any benzos that are not available on prescription via the NHS. So sometimes these are created to circumvent international control and scheduling. Some of them, like atizolam, for example, are licensed for use in other countries but aren't available legally in the UK. Others, like bromazepam, are primarily research chemicals and were never meant to be used on humans. And many of these street benzos have a higher potency at the GABA receptor and a shorter duration of action than diazepam, which can lead to repeat administration. So they looked at deaths where benzodiazepines had been detected between 1999 and 2021, and they included any cases that had been reported to the NP-SUM database by the 1st of November 2022. Basically, because there's quite a bit of a delay with some coronial areas for cases to go to inquest, they might not have caught necessarily all of the benzodiazepine-related deaths in 2021. So they had 14,837 deaths with 16,208 detections of benzodiazepines in this dataset. Annual deaths following benzodiazepine use had doubled over the past decade. So in 2010, they had 556 deaths following benzodiazepine use, and in 2020, they had 1,245 deaths. So with this dataset, they had access to GP records and hospital records to be able to determine whether an individual was prescribed benzodiazepines and had access via prescription at the time of their death. And quite a large chunk of these, 62% of the benzodiazepines detected, were thought to have come from an illicit source. And diazepam was the most commonly detected prescribable benzodiazepine that had been obtained without a prescription, and that amounted to 77% of detections.
So even though a lot of these detections were benzodiazepines which are licensed for use, there was quite a lot of diversion of medications. So what about the non-prescribable benzos, the street benzos?
So street benzodiazepines contributed to a relatively small number of benzodiazepine-related deaths, only 8.5%. But there seems to be an increase in street benzodiazepine detections between 2015 and 2020. It increases by 1,200%, I think they quote in the paper.
That's quite a huge increase. And of course, this data cuts off at 2020, 2021?
2021.
We know from our experience that that trend, although we don't have the data for it in this paper, our experience is that that trend probably continued to increase. Certainly, we see a lot more bromazolam and alprazolam now.
Interestingly, the type of street benzos that were detected changed over the time period of this paper. So they detected 18 street benzodiazepines, and 8 of these were first detected between 2019 and 2021. There seems to be a spike in different street benzodiazepines being detected more recently. And with this data set, they were able to look at some demographic data. So street benzos were more likely to be detected in males and in a younger age group. But interestingly, the average age of individuals where street benzos were detected increased over time, from 34 years in 2011 to 39 years in 2021.
That's interesting. That might just reflect the ageing drug-using population, because I think that stat has probably been true for a lot of drug-related deaths.
Probably. It'd be interesting to look to see whether that pattern covers other types of drugs.
So let's just go back a sec, looking at street benzos. A lot of these are novel compounds, aren't they? These are compounds that were designed to maybe circumvent international controls. So they are structurally similar to prescribed benzodiazepines, but have some chemical modifications. We've talked a lot on this podcast about designer drugs or chemically altered drugs. And a lot of these are quite potent, aren't they, compared to some of the existing prescribed benzos?
Yeah, and they often have a shorter half-life than traditional benzodiazepines like diazepam.
Diazepam's got quite a very long half-life in terms of its activity because it's got so many active metabolites. Not all of novel benzos do have a short half-life, though. I know flubromazolam has very long half-life. We had a case many years ago of an individual who thought he had bought diazepam, and it turned out to be flubromazolam and was unconscious or not described as not right for quite a few days. So that in lies the problem, doesn't it? That these benzos perhaps are not necessarily what people think they're getting. They can sometimes be unpredictable. They're not made to pharmaceutical standards most of the time, although, as you've said, some drugs like atizolam might be diverted medication from other countries. And so they can be a bit unpredictable. They can be harder to dose. And as you said, they've got shorter half-lives, so can sometimes lead to compulsive redosing.
So in this paper, they were also able to pull together some other data related to seizures and voluntary submissions of benzodiazepine tablets. So Tic Tac is a drug identification company. They often work with music festivals to test tablets, powders, things like that have been seized. The data that we're looking at in this particular paper comes from between 2017 and 2021, and the benzodiazepines that were collected from 22 music festivals in England and Wales. Obviously, no music festivals were going on in 2020, so we have no data for that year. And they had 461 seizures of benzodiazepines, which included 14 different benzos, diazepam being the most commonly seized at 42%, followed by alprazolam, also known as Xanax, at 30%, atizolam at 20%, and then they found 11 other benzos, which made up the remaining 8%. They also got data from Wednos. So Wednos is a drug testing service. It stands for Welsh Emerging Drugs and Identification of Novel Substances. people can voluntarily post pills and powders to them, and they'll test them and then tell you what's in them. And their website's really good because it has like purchase intents listed. People can put in the sorts of effects they felt with the different drugs they've taken. So it's quite a useful tool. Between 2017 and 2021, there were 3,554 submissions to Wednos with 23 different benzodiazepines detected. And this also mirrors the tic-tac seizure data. So you've got diazepam as being the most commonly detected benzodiazepine, then followed by atizolam at 20%, alprazolam was detected in 14%, and then you had flubromazolam and flualprazolam detected in 11%, and the 18 other benzos totaled the remaining 12%.
And did their data broadly match the pattern seen in the drug-related death data?
So broadly, the data from the seizures and the data from Wednos mirror the post-mortem dataset that we've looked at in this paper.
So a general rise in benzodiazepines over the entire period, with newer benzos occurring in the later years of the study.
Exactly.
So benzodiazepine detections are increasing, and novel benzos, street benzos, are increasing significantly more recently. What's the implications of all of this?
So from a drug-related death point of view and testing in post-mortem samples, the rise in different types of novel benzos just makes things a little bit trickier. Trying to stay ahead of the curve and being up to date with the sort of benzodiazepines that are being seen so that we can make sure we're detecting them. And then from an interpretation point of view, it's quite tricky to know like their relative potencies and what sort of the levels really mean in a post-mortem context for each of these new novel benzodiazepines.
I think the other thing with benzos as well is that in a drug-related death perspective, typically they're not the sole cause of death. So often benzodiazepines are detected in the context of polydrug use, mixed with alcohol, mixed with opioids like heroin. And actually, in general terms, benzodiazepines don't often, they can, but they don't often lead to fatal outcomes without other drugs being present. So in some respects, the context of the drug-related death data, there's not huge amounts of, other than the points you've made about staying ahead of the curve, perhaps this isn't necessarily that significant. But I think that the drug-related deaths, although this is interesting data, there are harms for benzodiazepines outside of death. I said at the start of this that benzodiazepines can be, it can be addiction forming. They can lead to withdrawal symptoms. They can lead to even seizures. And a changing trend of benzodiazepines from a predictable market of mostly diazepam to a mix of 25 potentially different compounds, not quite sure which one you're getting, actually could have harms outside of post-mortem context.
And I think that's what the scary thing is when you look at the Wednos data, and the purchase intent for a lot of these benzodiazepines is either diazepam or Xanax or alprazolam. And those seem to be what people want to buy. And more often than not, that's not what they're getting.
Yeah, we should briefly mention actually about Xanax, shouldn't we? That although it's not available on prescription in the NHS in the UK, it is widely pharmaceutical in the States. And so I think people do, when they buy Xanax in inverted commas, believe they are buying a pharmaceutical product. And actually the Wednos data kind of suggests that, especially recently, that may not be the case. It might be flualprazolam, for example, which is a bit more potent. And clearly the inconsistent dosing of these aren't being produced in GLP, good laboratory practice accredited labs, or good GMP, I suppose, for pharmaceutical production, isn't it? Good manufacturing process labs. So they could well be really inconsistently dosed, as well as being potentially not a chemical that you were anticipating.
So it does appear in the general drug-related death trends that street benzodiazepines being detected are going up and up year on year. And that might be possibly due to a reduction in prescribing benzos.
So doctors are handing out fewer prescriptions for traditional pharmaceuticals like diazepam, and as a result, people are sourcing these illicitly. We did see a rise, or we have seen a rise, I don't have the data for this, I couldn't find a study, but anecdotally there has been a rise in benzodiazepine use amongst adolescents, younger people, possibly related to growing up during the lockdowns that we experienced a few years ago during COVID. That certainly did play a bit, I think, on people's anxieties, and so people are going out and self-medicating some of the time.
Yeah, that's a completely fair point, and especially with really long waiting lists to be seen by your GP or mental health services, people are going to try and find an alternative solution.
One other thing this study looked at a little bit, didn't it, was it looked at regional differences for benzodiazepine use. In particular, I think this data covered England, Wales and Northern Ireland.
Yeah. And
Northern Ireland had the highest and also the highest deprivation scores.
I think so, yep.
So there might be a sort of socio-economic impact as well. Again, possibly related to self-medication and poor mental health, I guess. We probably won't know that, at least from this study.
So Rob, what trends have you seen in benzodiazepine use?
So my experience is definitely consistent with this paper, that there is a rise in particularly newer benzodiazepines in the last few years. And we've certainly seen a few notable cases. I've certainly seen cases where we have detected street benzodiazepines that have had significant harm. So I recall at least one case where an individual thought they had bought diazepam and it turned out to be clonazepam. In fact, it's the only time I've ever seen clonazepam, and they were in hospital for quite a significant period of time because it turned out not to be what they thought was diazepam. And we had another run of cases. I recall 4 or 5 people admitted, all testing positive for flubromazolam, because there were these really, really potently dosed tablets that had flooded the streets one weekend. And so there really is quite a significant risk of harm from some of these compounds, in particular the inability to accurately dose them and know exactly what you're getting. So why do benzodiazepines seem to carry less social stigma than some drugs? Is it because they're seen as pharmaceuticals and therefore kind of okay?
I mean, possibly. I know they often get mentioned in the news and in other popular culture aspects, so maybe it's just
people in America knocking back their Xanax and
so people then think
that.
it's okay and it's
that's
quote unquote safe, and
certainly a possibility, isn't it? What harm reduction strategies are there if people do choose to use street benzodiazepines or illicitly sourced benzodiazepines? You mentioned Wedanos.
And Wedanos is a great service that I think people should be utilising more to really know what they're actually getting when they are buying drugs.
Absolutely. If you aren't aware of Wedanos, do go and check them out. They do a absolutely fantastic harm reduction service. So prediction time. What do you think the future is going to look like in terms of street benzodiazepines? We've seen the data up to 2021. We know from our experience that trend continued up to now, 2025. What do you think is going to happen over the next 5 years?
I reckon we're just going to see more street benzos and different types of street benzos, especially with changes in legislation. Recently, they've cracked down on bromazepam, which we see quite often and is quite a popular street benzo. So it'd be interesting to see whether that hangs around or whether a new novel benzo takes its place. We'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, so I think we're going to wrap it up there. I hope you've enjoyed listening. Do give us a like or a follow, or even better, tell your friends about us. That would be amazing.
You can comment on Spotify, which is a new feature. We had a comment fairly recently on one of our episodes, so thank you. You can also message us or comment over on our Instagram. So we are the_tox_lab. We'd love to hear from you over there as well. And if you've got any recommendations on topics you'd like us to talk about, feel free to message us. So I hope you've all had a wonderful week. We'll see you next time. Bye.